The letter in Stone McCrae's pocket felt like a fragile, deceitful thing. Its pages, thin as moth wings and filled with a looping, delicate script, spoke of a woman named Clara Hart. They promised a companion with a gentle disposition, skilled in the domestic arts, a woman who would bring a touch of Boston refinement to the raw, unforgiving landscape of his Montana homestead. It promised a partner to soothe the jagged edges of a man hollowed out by war. For months, that promise had been a flickering candle in the vast darkness of his solitude. Now, standing on the windswept platform of the rickety depot, the candle was unceremoniously snuffed out. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Silas, jerked a thumb over his shoulder. That'd be her, the Hart woman. Stone's gaze followed, and the breath caught in his throat. This was not the petite, soft-spoken Clara he had envisioned. The woman descending from the coach was tall, standing nearly eye-to-eye with him, a feat few men managed. Her shoulders were broad beneath a practical, dark wool coat, and she moved not with the hesitant grace described in the letters, but with a solid, grounded certainty. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, was handsome rather than pretty, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a stormy winter sky. Those eyes, clear and unervingly direct, scanned the dusty settlement before landing on him, holding his gaze without a flicker of demureness. She carried no delicate valise, but a single sturdy trunk that the driver struggled to heave onto the platform. He felt a surge of raw, bitter anger. He had been duped. This was some cruel joke, a bait and switch played on a lonely man hundreds of miles from civilization. He strode forward, the crumpled letter a hot brand in his hand. "You're not Clara," he stated, his voice a low growl that had once made soldiers straighten their spines. The woman didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, a flicker of something unreadable, resignation, perhaps, or grim amusement, in her expression. "No," she said, her voice lower than he expected, and clear as a mountain stream. Clara decided the frontier wasn't to her liking. "I am her sister, Nora." "Her sister?" Stone repeated, the words flat and dead. He held up the letter. "This paper says Clara Hart was coming to be my wife." "That paper was written under false pretenses," Nora replied, her gaze unwavering. "My sister has a talent for crafting pretty words that bear little resemblance to the truth. She also has a talent for creating situations that others must resolve." She looked past him, at the jagged peaks of the Bridger Mountains clawing at the sky. "I am here to honor the agreement. Passage was paid. Commitment was made. I will uphold it." Stone stared at her, bewildered. There was no apology, no plea for understanding. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. He saw the calluses on her hands as she adjusted the collar of her coat. He saw the weariness in the set of her shoulders, a fatigue that went deeper than a long journey. And he saw the hard-won strength that held her upright. This was not a woman who would swoon at the sight of a mouse or complain about the wind that never ceased its mournful cry. "I run a homestead," he said, the words a test, a warning. "It's hard work, brutal. There are no socials, no neighbors for miles. It's just survival." "I understand what survival entails, Mr. McCrae," she said, and for the first time, her tone softened, but it was with a chilling gravity, not warmth. "Better than you might imagine." A profound contradiction warred within him. The man who craved solitude and had sought a quiet, unobtrusive companion was now faced with a woman whose very presence was a force of nature. Yet, the soldier in him, the man who had learned to judge character in the crucible of battle, recognized something else: resilience. This woman wouldn't break. The Montana winter would not break her. The isolation would not break her. He suspected little on God's green earth could. He was supposed to send her back, to rage at the deception. Instead, he heard himself say, "The wagon's this way." He picked up one end of her heavy trunk, and was only mildly surprised when she immediately lifted the other, her grip firm and sure. The journey to his cabin would be long and silent, a quiet reckoning with the monumental shift in his world. The soft, pliant future he had imagined was gone. In its place stood this imposing, enigmatic woman, and the chilling, unspoken question of what kind of trouble could possibly drive a person like her to the edge of the known world. The ride to the homestead was a study in silence. The rattling of the wagon wheels and the snort of the mules were the only sounds punctuating the vast, oppressive quiet of the valley. Stone kept his eyes on the trail, his hands firm on the reins, his mind a maelstrom. He felt the weight of Nora's presence beside him, a solid, unmoving reality. He had spent years cultivating his isolation, building his cabin log by painstaking log, taming a small patch of land from the wilderness as a penance, a way to silence the ghosts of Shiloh and Antietam that screamed in his head. He had wanted a wife not for companionship, but for quietude, a soft presence to fill the empty spaces without demanding anything of the hollowed-out man he had become. Nora Hart was not quietude. She was a declaration. She, for her part, seemed unbothered by his silence. Her gaze was fixed on the landscape, her expression analytical. She wasn't admiring the stark beauty of the golden cottonwoods or the deep blue of the sky. She was assessing it. He saw her note the scarcity of water in a dry creek bed, the quality of the timber on a distant slope, the signs of deer tracks near a thicket. She was reading the land like a book written in a familiar language. When they finally arrived, the cabin stood stark against the looming shadow of the mountains. It was a simple, sturdy structure, built for function, not comfort. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Inside, a fire was already banked in the hearth. He had prepared for Clara, laying out a clean blanket on the small cot he'd built and setting a jar of wildflowers on the rough-hewn table. Seeing it now, in Nora's presence, felt absurd. She stepped inside, her tall frame seeming to shrink the small space. She took in the single room. His bed in one corner, the cot in the other, the stone fireplace, the table, the shelves holding his few provisions, with that same assessing gaze. There was no hint of disappointment, no feminine gasp of dismay. She simply unpinned her hat, set it on the table next to the wilting flowers, and looked at him. "The agreement was for a wife," Stone said, the words tasting like ash. "That requires a preacher. A vow." "The agreement was for a partner," Nora corrected him gently, her eyes meeting his. "Someone to share the burden of this life. My sister offered you a fantasy. I am offering you a reality. I will earn my keep, Mr. McCrae. Can cook, clean, mend. I can also set a fence post, split firewood, and tend a wound. Give me a trial period, a season. If, by the first heavy snow, you find I am not suited to this life or to your needs, I will take my leave. I ask only for shelter and sustenance until then." It was a practical, almost transactional proposal. There was no appeal to his sympathy, no mention of her own predicament. It appealed to the pragmatist in him, the man who understood contracts of survival better than contracts of the heart. He looked at her strong hands, at the determined set of her jaw, and knew she was not lying about her capabilities. He thought of the coming winter, of the endless, back-breaking work that lay ahead. Doing it with another pair of capable hands, even those belonging to a stranger who was not what he'd asked for, was better than doing it alone. "The cot is yours," he said, his voice gruff. "There's stew on the hearth. I'll see to the mules." He turned and walked out, needing the crisp, cold air to clear his head. He was not taking a wife. He was taking on a hired hand, a partner in a venture of survival. It was a cold comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. He did not see the deep, shuddering breath Nora released once his back was turned, her rigid posture slumping for just a moment as she leaned against the solid log wall, the first true sanctuary she had known in a very long time. The next morning, Stone rose before dawn, the habit of war and farming ingrained in him. He moved quietly, stoking the fire, intending to start his chores before his new, unwelcome houseguest awoke. He was pulling on his boots when a sound from outside made him pause. It was the rhythmic, solid thwack of an axe biting into wood. He straightened up, his brow furrowed, and opened the cabin door. In the gray, pre-dawn light, Nora was at the woodpile. She had shed her heavy traveling coat for a simple, dark dress, its sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing strong, corded forearms. She was wielding his spare axe with an efficiency that stunned him. Her swings weren't wild or clumsy. They were controlled, powerful, and precise. She wasn't hacking at the logs. She was splitting them, using the weight of the axe and the grain of the wood in a way that spoke of long practice. A neat stack of split firewood was already growing beside her. He stood there for a long moment, unseen, watching her. In Boston, a woman of her station would have had servants to perform such tasks. Her hands would be soft, her muscles untoned. But Nora moved with the ingrained competence of someone for whom labor was not a choice but a necessity. The image of the delicate Clara, who had written of her proficiency with needlepoint, evaporated from his mind, replaced by this potent reality. He cleared his throat, and she stopped, turning to face him. There was no sweat on her brow, only a faint flush on her cheeks from the exertion. She wasn't even breathing heavily. "I was going to do that," he said, his voice sounding inadequate. "The woodpile was low," she replied simply, resting the axe head on the chopping block. "The fire needs feeding." It seemed a logical place to start. She looked him over. "You have a slight list to your left when you walk." "An old injury?" Stone was taken aback by the directness of the question. "Shrapnel. From the war, he never spoke of it. The townspeople knew he was a veteran, but they didn't ask questions. The pain was a private thing, a constant, dull ache in his hip that grew sharper in the cold. "It will worsen as the weather turns," she stated, not with pity, but with the diagnostic certainty of a physician. "I have some knowledge of herbal remedies. Willow bark can help with the inflammation. I saw some growing by the creek on our way in." He didn't know what to say. In the space of a few minutes, she had demonstrated a capacity for hard labor and a sharp, observant intelligence that unsettled him. This wasn't just a pair of hands. It was a keen mind. He had expected to have to teach his new bride everything about this life. It was becoming increasingly clear that Nora Hart might have things to teach him. "There are fence posts that need mending on the north pasture," he said, changing the subject. "It's a two-person job." "Then let's not waste the daylight," she said, setting the axe aside. They worked together all day, a silent, efficient team. She anticipated his needs, handing him tools before he asked, holding posts steady with a strength that matched his own. The awkwardness of the previous night was replaced by the simple, shared rhythm of work. They were no longer a man and a woman in a compromised situation, but two people fighting the same battle against a wilderness that was always trying to reclaim what was hers. That evening, as they sat at the table eating a meal she had prepared, a surprisingly savory rabbit stew, he finally broke the silence. "Where did you learn to work like that?" Nora took a slow sip of water before answering, her gaze distant. "My father was a doctor. Not in a fine Boston office, but in the countryside. He believed knowledge was useless without practical application. He taught me botany, anatomy, and that self-reliance was the only true virtue. When he passed, and we had to move to the city to live with relatives, those virtues were not as highly prized in a woman. It was a small crack in the wall of her reserve, a glimpse of the world she had left behind, a world that valued needlepoint over knowledge, fragility over strength. A world that had no place for a woman like Nora Hart. Stone found himself thinking, for the first time, that maybe she hadn't just come to Montana to honor her sister's broken promise. Maybe she had come to escape. A few weeks bled into a month, and the rhythm of their shared existence settled into a comfortable, if unspoken, routine. Stone found the cabin was warmer, the meals more regular, the mending of his clothes no longer an afterthought. Nora moved through his space with a quiet competence that was beginning to feel less like an intrusion and more like a necessity. She asked for nothing, but she gave her labor, her intelligence, and her unwavering resilience to the homestead. She learned the land with a startling quickness, identifying edible plants and herbs, finding the best fishing spots in the creek, and noticing the subtle shifts in animal behavior that heralded a change in the weather. One night, the ghosts came for Stone. He was back on the sunken road at Antietam, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. The screams of dying men and horses were a physical weight in his ears. He was thrashing in his bed, caught in the grip of the nightmare, a cry tearing from his throat. He awoke with a jolt, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nora was standing beside his bed, a lamp held aloft in one hand. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. In her other hand, she held his Spencer rifle, which he always kept loaded and propped against the wall. She wasn't holding it like a frightened woman who had grabbed the nearest weapon. She was holding it with a familiar ease, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard, the barrel pointed safely at the floor. Her expression was not one of fear or alarm. It was one of calm, profound understanding. "The war?" she asked softly. He could only nod, the words trapped in his throat by a knot of shame and remembered horror. He expected her to recoil, to look at him with the pity or fear he so despised. Instead, she set the rifle down and went to the hearth, returning with a cup of water. "Breathe, Mr. McCrae," she said, her voice steady and low. "You are in your cabin. You are in Montana. The year is 1875. You are safe," she recited the facts like a litany, an anchor in the swirling chaos of his memory. She didn't touch him, didn't offer empty platitudes. She offered him the truth of the present moment, a lifeline back from the horrors of the past. He took the cup, his hand shaking, and drank. The cool water soothed his raw throat. As the last vestiges of the nightmare receded, he looked at her, truly looked at her, in the soft lamplight. He saw not an imposing stranger, but a woman of immense, quiet strength. "In Boston," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They celebrated the returning heroes with parades and speeches. But in the quiet of the night, in the wards my father sometimes visited, I saw the true cost. I saw the men who came back in body, but left their souls on the battlefield." She paused, her gaze turning towards the dark window. "There are many kinds of battles, Mr. McCrae. Not all of them are fought with guns." In that moment, the last of his resentment towards her, towards the deception that had brought her to his door, finally dissolved. He saw a fellow survivor, a person who understood that the deepest wounds were the ones no one else could see. He had answered a letter from a woman who promised comfort, but fate had sent him a woman who offered something far more valuable: understanding. He had not realized, until now, how desperately he needed it. The first snow had just begun to dust the high peaks when trouble rode into their valley. Stone was splitting the last of the logs Nora had felled when he saw the riders. 3 of them, moving with the lazy arrogance of men who knew the land didn't belong to them but believed it soon would. He recognized the man in the lead. Jack Reynolds, a land agent with a reputation as sharp and dirty as a rusty spur. He worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad, a fact he was fond of announcing, as if the name itself gave him authority over the law. Stone rested his axe and waited, his body tense. Nora, who had been hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 pines, stopped her work, her eyes narrowing as she watched the approaching men. She didn't run for the cabin. She simply stood her ground, a quiet and immovable presence. Reynolds reined in his horse a few feet from Stone, his gaze sweeping over the homestead with a proprietary air. He was a man made soft by town living, but his eyes were hard and predatory. "McCrae," he said, his tone oily. "Still squatting on railroad land. I see. This is my land," Stone said, his voice flat and cold. "Bought and paid for at the land office. I have the deed." Reynolds chuckled, a humorless sound. "Deeds can get lost. Fires happen. Winters are hard on a lone man." His eyes slid over to Nora, his gaze lingering with a dismissive, insulting appraisal. "Though I see you've found yourself some help. A bit substantial for my tastes, but I suppose beggars can't be choosers." Before Stone could react, his hand balling into a fist, Nora spoke. "This man is not a beggar, sir," she said, her voice ringing with cold clarity. "And this is his home. You are trespassing." Reynolds's sneer widened. He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. A feisty one. Well, ma'am, your husband here is sitting on a prime section. The railroad has a vested interest in this valley. We're prepared to make a fair offer. $500 for the land and the cabin. It was an insult. The land, with its timber and access to the creek, was worth 10 times that. It was an offer designed to be refused, a prelude to violence. The land is not for sale, Stone said, his hand moving to rest on the handle of the axe. It wasn't a pistol, but it was a weapon, and the men knew it. Reynolds's eyes hardened. That's a shame. A real shame. He looked at his two men, thugs with dull eyes and gun belts slung low. Things have a way of getting complicated out here for stubborn folks. Fences get cut. Livestock wanders off. Accidents happen. It was a threat, plain and simple. I think you should leave, Nora said, taking a step forward. Her hands were empty, but her stance was a challenge. There was no fear in her eyes, only a righteous, protective anger that seemed to transform her. She was no longer just a woman earning her keep. She was a defender of this small piece of the world. For a moment, Reynolds seemed genuinely taken aback by her audacity. He stared at her, then at Stone's unyielding posture. With a final, contemptuous smirk, he wheeled his horse around. Have it your way, McCrae. But don't say I didn't warn you. They watched until the riders were small figures in the distance. The silence they left behind was heavy and fraught with a new kind of tension. The wilderness was a predictable adversary. Jack Reynolds and the Northern Pacific Railroad were not. Stone turned to Nora. The wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back with a steady hand. You shouldn't have done that, he said, though there was no heat in his words. Done what? She asked, meeting his gaze. Allowed a man to insult you and threaten our home? I will not stand by meekly while predators circle, Mr. McCrae. I told you I came here to be a partner. That partnership extends to its defense. Her use of the word "our" settled deep in his chest. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the change that had taken place. This was no longer his homestead, and she was no longer a temporary guest. In that moment of shared defiance, standing against a common enemy, the pretense of their trial period fell away. They were in this together. The first heavy snow was falling, but the thought of asking her to leave was an impossibility. Sending her away would be like sending away his own right arm. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, a bastion against the encroaching darkness, both outside the cabin and in the valley. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long while, the threat from Reynolds hanging unspoken between them. Finally, Stone looked across the table at Nora, who was mending one of his shirts with small, neat stitches. Why did you really come here, Nora? He asked, the question he had held back for months. It wasn't just your sister. A woman like you must have had other options. Nora set her sewing aside, her hands folding in her lap. She stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. Options are a luxury afforded to women who fit the mold society has cast for them, she said, her voice low and laced with an old bitterness. I did not. She told him then of Boston, of her life after her father's death. She spoke of her uncle, a man who saw her intelligence not as a gift, but as an affront to his own authority. She told him of Edmund Vale, a suitor her uncle had chosen, a man of wealth and influence who wanted a decorative wife, an ornament to hang on his arm. He found my interest in my father's medical texts and my opinions on politics to be unseemly, Nora recounted, her voice tight. He wanted to own my dowry, but he wanted to cage my mind. When she refused his proposal, Vale, a man of immense pride and petty cruelty, could not abide the rejection. He started a rumor, a vicious whisper that she was mentally unstable, an unnatural woman whose sharp mind was a sign of madness. In the stifling, hypocritical society of Boston, the rumor took root and grew, poisoning her reputation and isolating her completely. My sister Clara, Nora continued, a sad smile touching her lips, always chose the path of least resistance. She saw my situation as a stain on the family. When she saw your advertisement for a wife, she saw a solution. A way to be rid of the embarrassing, difficult sister. She wrote those letters, crafting a perfect image of herself, knowing you would accept. She never intended to come. The plan was always to send me in her place, to banish me to a place so remote no one would ever hear of the scandalous Nora Hart again. Stone listened, a slow burn of anger building in his gut. Anger at the sister who had used her, at the suitor who had slandered her, at a world that would discard a woman of such substance. He finally understood the deep well of strength he saw in her. It had been forged in a fire of scorn and betrayal. "So you came," he said quietly, "knowing it was a lie." "It was my only escape," she admitted, finally looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It was a chance to build a life where my back and my brain were assets, not liabilities. A place where survival is the only judgment that matters." He felt a powerful urge to cross the small space between them, to offer a comfort he didn't know how to give. Instead, he shared a piece of his own brokenness. "After the war," he began, his voice rough, "I couldn't stand the cities, the noise, the people. Everyone pretending things were normal again. Nothing was normal. I'd see men laughing in a saloon and all I could picture was the field at Gettysburg. It felt like I was a ghost, and no one could see me." He looked at his hands. "So I came out here. I thought if I was alone, truly alone, maybe the ghosts would stay quiet." "And have they?" she asked softly. He looked at her, at this strong, brave woman who had been sent to him by a cruel twist of fate. "They've been quieter since you arrived." The admission hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful thing. It was more intimate than any touch, more binding than any vow. They were two broken people, exiled from their former lives, who had found an unlikely sanctuary in each other. The threat of Jack Reynolds was real and deadly, but in that moment, Stone knew he would not face it alone. He was no longer just defending a piece of land. He was defending his home. He was defending Nora. The threats escalated. A section of their northern fence was cut, and their 2 milk cows wandered off. It took Stone and Nora a full day of tracking to find them, miles away and spooked. A week later, Stone was in the nearby town of Three Forks, picking up supplies from Tom Pike's general store. Tom, a wiry man with a kind face, pulled him aside. "Be careful, Stone," he warned, his voice low. "Reynolds and his crew were in here last night, drunk and boasting. They were talking about the Turner place east of you. Said old man Turner ought to be careful with lit lanterns in his barn." The veiled threat made Stone's blood run cold. The Turners were a young family with 3 small children, good people who were barely scratching a living from the rocky soil. They were an easier target than he was. He rode home with a sense of urgency, relaying the news to Nora. Her face grew grim. "They won't stop with threats," she said. "Men like that, their power comes from making others feel powerless. They will make an example of someone to frighten the rest of the valley into selling." Her words proved prophetic. 2 nights later, they were awoken by a hellish orange glow illuminating the eastern sky. They rushed outside into the frigid air and saw it, a pillar of fire and smoke rising from the direction of the Turner homestead. The barn. Stone saddled his horse in a fury, but Nora stopped him, her hand firm on his arm. "Going now, alone and angry, is what they want," she said, her voice a sharp note of reason in his rage. "You'll ride into an ambush. We have to be smarter than them." He hated that she was right. The following day, they rode to the Turner place. The scene was one of utter devastation. The barn was a heap of blackened, smoldering timbers. William Turner stood staring at the ruin, his face a mask of despair, while his wife tried to comfort their crying children. Their 2 horses and the milk cow were gone, stolen in the confusion. "Reynolds was here yesterday," Turner said, his voice hollow. "Offered me $200. I told him to go to hell. He kicked at a charred beam. Now this. We're ruined. We have nothing left for winter." Looking at the faces of that defeated family, something shifted in Stone. His fight was no longer just about his own land. It was about the valley, about the principle that people couldn't be bullied and burned out of their homes by greed. He looked at Nora, and he saw the same resolve mirrored in her eyes. They spent the rest of the day helping the Turners salvage what they could, and Stone gave them half of his own winter provisions. When they rode back to their own cabin, they moved with a new, shared purpose. "Marshal Jenkins won't do anything," Stone said grimly. "He's a good man, but he's outmanned and terrified of the railroad's influence." "Then we cannot rely on the law," Nora stated. "We must become our own law." That evening, they didn't just plan a defense. They planned a war. They spread a map of the homestead on the table. Stone, using the tactical knowledge he'd learned at such a bloody cost, pointed out lines of sight, fields of fire, and potential ambush points. Nora, with her sharp, analytical mind, pointed out weaknesses in his plans, suggesting they use the terrain to their advantage, creating bottlenecks in the narrow ravines and using the dense woods as cover. "They will come at night," Stone surmised. "They'll try to use fire again, to create chaos. Then we must be prepared for it," Nora said. She began gathering every bucket and container they owned, filling them with water from the creek and placing them around the cabin. She tore strips of cloth to be used as bandages and laid out the contents of her small medical kit, the one her father had given her, with practiced efficiency. She moved with a calm, focused intensity that steadied his own raging anger. She was not just a partner in defense. She was a commander, his equal in every way. As he watched her load his spare shotgun, her movements sure and steady, he felt a profound sense of awe. He had sent for a delicate flower from Boston and had been given a Valkyrie from the heart of the mountains. They worked for 2 days, turning the cabin and the land around it into a fortress. They cleared brush to create clear firing lanes. They boarded up the smaller of the 2 windows and reinforced the door with a heavy log brace. They set up a watch schedule, taking turns sleeping, neither ever truly resting. The air in the cabin was thick with anticipation, the quiet moments charged with an unspoken understanding. They were 2 soldiers before a battle, and in the shared danger, they found a deeper intimacy than they had ever known. On the 3rd night they came. A sliver of moon offered little light, casting the valley in deep, deceptive shadows. Stone was on watch, positioned behind a rocky outcropping that overlooked the trail to the cabin, his Spencer rifle resting comfortably in his hands. He heard them before he saw them, the soft thud of hooves on dirt, a muffled cough. For riders moving slowly, their forms like phantoms in the gloom. He slipped back to the cabin, his movements silent. "They're here," he whispered to Nora, who was waiting by the door, the shotgun in her hands. 4 of them. Her only response was a sharp, determined nod. She took her position at the reinforced window, the one that faced the front of the cabin. Stone moved to the other, which overlooked the woodpile and the side approach. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence stretched, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of his own heart. Then a flicker of light. One of the men was approaching on foot, a torch in his hand, its flame dancing in the darkness. He was heading for the lean-to where they stored their hay. The plan was clear. Set a fire, draw them out, and pick them off. "Wait for my shot," Stone breathed. He raised the Spencer, took aim at the dark shape of the man with the torch, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the night silence. The man screamed and dropped the torch, which sputtered and died in the damp grass. From the darkness came a string of curses and then the roar of gunfire as the other 3 men opened fire on the cabin. Splinters exploded from the log walls. A bullet punched through the window near Nora's head, and she didn't even flinch. She waited, patient, until she saw the muzzle flash from one of the attackers who was using the woodpile for cover. She raised the shotgun, aimed, and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, and it was followed by a cry of pain from outside. The fight became a deadly dance of shadow and sound. Stone and Nora worked in perfect concert, communicating with single words or gestures. He would fire, forcing the men to take cover, while she reloaded. She would call out their positions as she saw them move. They were a single, fighting unit, their years of separate struggles. His in war, hers in a hostile society, now combined into a formidable defense. One of Reynolds's men made a desperate rush for the blind side of the cabin. Stone saw him coming, a dark shape moving fast. He swung the rifle, but knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Suddenly, the cabin door swung open. Nora stood silhouetted in the doorway, the heavy cast-iron skillet from the hearth clutched in her hand. As the man rounded the corner, she swung it with all her might. The sound of iron connecting with skull was sickeningly final. The man dropped like a sack of grain. She darted back inside, barring the door just as another volley of shots peppered the wood. Her chest was heaving, her eyes wide and fierce in the dim light. Stone looked at her, then at the man she had taken down, and a grim, wild pride swelled in his chest. The firefight lasted for what felt like an eternity. But the attackers, who had expected to terrorize a lone man and a helpless woman, were met with a disciplined and ferocious defense. They were losing. After the second man went down with a cry, his leg shattered by a well-aimed shot from Stone's rifle, the remaining attacker lost his nerve. He fired one last, wild shot before scrambling for his horse and fleeing into the night. Silence descended, thick and ringing. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. The battle was over. They had won. In the aftermath, they moved with a quiet, exhausted purpose. Stone checked the men outside. 2 were wounded but would live. 1 was unconscious. He bound their wounds and their hands, a cold efficiency guiding his movements. He would take them to Marshal Jenkins in the morning. This time there would be undeniable proof. Inside, Nora lit another lamp, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. She saw the dark stain spreading across Stone's left sleeve. "You're hit," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "It's just a graze," he grunted. But she ignored him, gently pushing him into a chair. She tore away the fabric, revealing a nasty gash along his forearm. Without a word, she cleaned the wound with whiskey, her touch surprisingly gentle, and bandaged it with clean strips of linen. As she worked, her head bent over his arm. He looked at the determined set of her mouth, at the smudge of soot on her cheek. He had never felt such a profound sense of connection to another human being. They had faced death together and had emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. When she finished, she looked up, her stormy eyes meeting his. The space between them was charged, all pretenses stripped away by the violence of the night. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers gently brushing the soot from her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. "Nora," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, something that had been quietly growing in the fertile ground of their shared hardship. "You don't have to say it," she whispered. "I know." He didn't pull his hand away. He let it rest on her cheek, a silent vow passing between them. The contract of convenience was long dead. The trial period was over. In its place was a bond forged in fire and gunpowder, a partnership of equals who had found in each other the one person who could see them for who they truly were. The cabin was scarred, their bodies were bruised, but for the first time, the homestead felt truly, completely, like home. They had not just defended the land, they had claimed their future, together. The rising sun cast a pale, clean light over the valley, revealing the scars of the night's battle. Stone delivered the 3 bound men to a shocked Marshal Jenkins, along with a cold, clear account of the attack. Faced with the wounded men and Stone's unwavering testimony, the law in Three Forks was finally forced to act. Warrants were issued for Jack Reynolds, who was discovered to have fled the territory, his scheme of intimidation and land-grabbing collapsing under the weight of his own violence. When Stone returned to the cabin, he found Nora replacing the splintered boards of the window frame, her movements as precise and determined as ever. The signs of the fight were all around them. The pockmarked logs, the overturned water buckets, the dark stains on the ground. But they were symbols not of defeat, but of their victory. He walked over to her, taking the hammer from her hand. "I'll do that," he said softly. She let him, her hand falling to her side. They stood for a moment in the morning light, the shared silence comfortable and deep. "The Turners and some of the other homesteaders are riding over this afternoon," she said. "News travels fast. They want to thank us. And to ask for help." Stone nodded. He had expected this. Their stand had not gone unnoticed. They had become a symbol of defiance. "We'll help them," he said. It wasn't a question. Their purpose had expanded beyond their own fence line. They would help the others organize, to stand together against the railroad or any other threat that came into their valley. They would build a community, one built on the same principles of mutual respect and shared strength that they had forged between themselves. He looked at Nora, at her strong, beautiful face, and the final wall around his heart crumbled. He had spent years seeking solitude, believing he was too damaged for connection. He had sent for a wife to be a quiet fixture in that solitude. But life had given him Nora, who had shattered his solitude and, in doing so, had saved him from it. She had not filled the empty spaces in his life. She had shown him how to rebuild. "Nora Hart," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I was a fool. I received a letter promising a gentle companion, and I was angry when I got a warrior instead. But a warrior was what I needed. It's what this land needs." He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. "There's a preacher who rides a circuit through Three Forks next month. I want you to be my wife, not as part of some business arrangement, but as my partner, my equal, in all things." A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, transforming her handsome features into something truly breathtaking. It was the first time he had seen her smile so freely, and it felt like watching the sun break through after a long winter. "Yes, Stone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." In the months and years that followed, the story of the fight at McCrae's homestead became a local legend. Stone and Nora became the anchors of their small, growing community, respected and sought out for their wisdom and strength. They helped their neighbors, stood up to new threats, and slowly, painstakingly, built a legacy of justice and resilience in the valley that had almost broken them. The ghosts of Stone's past never vanished entirely, but they grew quiet, their whispers drowned out by the sounds of a life well lived. The laughter they shared over a mended fence, the quiet conversations by the fire, the solid presence of his wife sleeping beside him. Nora, in turn, found the freedom she had craved. Her strength was celebrated, her intelligence was her husband's greatest pride, and her past was a distant shadow, powerless against the bright, fulfilling reality of her present. She had been sent away as an outcast, but she had found her true home in the heart of a battle-scarred frontiersman, and in the wild, beautiful land that had recognized her as one of its own. Together, they had built more than a homestead. They had built a sanctuary, proving that the most enduring bonds are not the ones we plan for, but the ones we have the courage to fight for.